So, as I say, thanks very much for joining us in Pipers'Persuasion, Alan, with one L and Alan with two L's. My father's fault when he was registered. I wasn't about at that time, so. So, what takes you to Singapore, Alan?
What takes me to Singapore? Well, it's a very long story, Alan. It's maybe I'll just give you a little brief history of myself. I'm actually from Rothurst, which is just south of Elgin, slightly south of Elgin, near Craigellachie. When I was 6 years old, we moved from Rothurst to Western Australia. My father took up a soldier settlers farm in Australia, which was just barren land. And we moved there just before my 6th birthday. We were there for 7 years, and then for various reasons, not the least of which my father couldn't put up with two of us being away at boarding school, he moved us all to Fremantle, just south of Perth in Western Australia. That's where I started my piping and drumming.
So who actually taught you piping in Australia then?
And my father immediately bought me a saxophone. He gave me a choice of a saxophone or an accordion, which would I like. So he bought me a saxophone. And I'd started lessons on the saxophone. And then he found out that there was a Caledonian Society who had a junior pipe band in Fremantle. So my sister, she's 2 years older than me, she wanted to join. So he decided he'd take us down there early in January. It was on a Sunday morning. And I wasn't going to let her go by herself, so I went as well. And so we both started learning the pipes. And we were learning from a fellow called Archie McMurchie, Mr. Bagpipes in Western Australia. Not as a player as such, because he was getting on in years, but certainly as a teacher. He was teaching all the better players. He had a son called John McMurchie, and that John McMurchie had a son called David McMurchie, who you might know. He's been in Scotland now for some time, and he's got a small business, McMurchie Bagpipes. Joined the army, and when he came out of the army, he started the thing. So I started with Archie, and I was learning bagpipes and learning saxophone at the same time. And also, I got interested in the drums at the same time. One of the drummers who lived not that far from me in Fremantle said if I wanted to learn, come around and he would show me how to play the drums. So at that stage, I was learning all three instruments. And by the time I was 14, I was playing saxophone quite well, and I'd started in a little band that we just did pubs and things like that, New Year's Eve shows and stuff. And I started getting a bit into jazz. So I bought a second saxophone, a tenor saxophone, and went to another teacher who specialised in tenor saxophone and jazz. And he straight away said to me, well, there's something wrong with the way you're blowing. And I said, oh, it might be the way I play my bagpipes. Yeah, that's what it is. He said, well, son, he said, I think you're going to have to make up your mind. What do you want to do here? Do you want to play jazz or do you want to play bagpipes? I sort of had, that was a bit of a smack in the mouth, and I went home quite. The following Sunday, I turned up to Archie McMurchie for my pipe lesson, and he says to me, son, I'm not sure that you want to play the bagpipes. You like the saxophone, don't you? So I made the choice, and I was already playing drums by then, and I had already competed on the drum in the novice section. So I said, okay, I'll stick with the saxophone and I'll go to the drums. But I kept on learning the pipes for many years, except I didn't blow bagpipes anymore. In '79, I joined the judging panel in Western Australia. In '88, I became the vice principal of the Australian Pipe Band College in Western Australia. And I also became the secretary of the Pipe Band Association in Western Australia. And I was also playing in a grade 3 band. And as vice principal of the college, I was required, which most vice principals didn't do, but the requirement is that you go to bands voluntarily and help them out. So I was going to many bands, around about 7 or 8 bands every week to help them out. Or not every week, but certainly every fortnight or so, because most of them suffered from what we now know as ensemble. We didn't call it that back then, but I'm actually a music teacher by trade. I've been teaching classroom music since '86. I was also doing the pipe band as a part-time thing, and I was teaching one school at that stage, Scotch College in Perth. I was teaching the drums at that part-time as well. In 1991, a young Thai fella came to our band. We're a grade 3 band called Armidale City Pipe Band. And he came along, and he was a hell of a nice young fella, and he could play a little bit, but not very well. But he wanted to play in our band. So I took him on, and he was doing great guns. And it turned out he was an optometrist, and he'd spent 2 years in Singapore studying his optometry, and now he was in Perth working his way through Australia as an optometrist. And he'd spent some time of that 2 years in Singapore at the People's Association Pipe Band, which is People's Association is a user-friendly government department, which is there to assist citizens. And he told me a lot about it. So I then found out, which I'd never known before, that there were pipe bands in Singapore. I'd never actually heard that said to me. So I knew a fair bit about what was happening here. And then in 1996, for the first time and only time in history, Perth was given the Australian and South Pacific Pipe Band Championships to run. And I was college vice principal, I was secretary of the association. I became convener of the committee to run that competition.
Very good. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So I had so many hats, I didn't know which one to put on in the morning. It turned out to be a wonderful success, by the way. But what that allowed me to do was contact some people. That young fellow had already left, but it gave me a heads up on what was here, and I was able to contact some people here, and by that, further to Hong Kong. And so I made invitations to all of those that I knew, and 2 of those bands came down for the 96 competition, women's band, which was also run by the People's Association.
Uh-huh.
So I got to know all of them. In fact, I actually helped them out with the bus, and they couldn't bring their own drums, so I was able to give them drums from one of the schools to play in the competition. So that was the start of my introduction to Singapore. Then in 2001, I was asked by the Singapore police to come with Ron Gallagher, who was the principal of the college, piping principal of the college, to come and run a course, a 3-week course for the women's pipe band, which was the women's arm of the bands of the police force. And so we came up to do that. And that was a very interesting thing. They were pretty poor quality, and the Gurkhas were also involved. They're sort of one hand-in-hand, brother sister type thing. Pretty poor quality, but one of the most entertaining, or 2 of the most entertaining bands I've ever seen. Their deportment, their attire, their movement, everything was absolutely wonderful, something I'd never seen before from any band. Unfortunately, their playing wasn't good. But by the time we'd left after 3 weeks, it wasn't too bad. So I came back again in a couple of months to that. Actually, that sad thing there was it coincided with the invasion of Afghanistan. The Gurkhas had to stand down immediately, and some of the ladies had to stand down as well. So we didn't quite finish the course with all our members. So I came back to do another little course for the Gurkhas. And to cut a long story short, I met a young lady who was in charge of the women's police. And that made my decision to come back in the future. Early in 2002, I applied for a job at an international school here as head of the music department. which I was given, and so I immediately came back for that. So that's how I arrived in Singapore. Oh, Brett Tiswell, I know Brett.
I take it you were in touch with him quite a bit when you were across in Australia.
Yes, and even here, he came up here. Ron Gallagher retired and handed the job to Brett. And I was already teaching bands here, so it was not right for me to be judging the bands in their they had a boys brigade competition here, and it was not right for me to carry on with that. So after quite a considerable discussion with the boys brigade, I said to them, the best thing you can do is you can write to Greg Gordon, who was the president of Australia at the time, and ask him to nominate someone to come up in Ron's place and someone to come up in my place, which he did. He sent Brett and Greg Bassani, who was the drumming principal then. So they came up here 3 years, I think it was, in a row, and judged that small competition.
Right, moving on to Singapore itself, just to tie off another strand here, I take it you never pursued the bagpipe angle again. They just left that alone and stuck to drums.
Yes. I never played in a band again on the pipes, no. But
Okay.
I still teach the chanter up here.
Aye, fine, good.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
What is the state of piping in Singapore? Do they have a pipe band association, or what do they have?
By 2008, I was teaching 6 school bands after school. So I'd do my full day's work, and then I'd go to one of the other schools and teach the bands. And one of those bands was a Catholic college run by the De La Salle brothers. And one of the brothers there, who was a Malaysian fella, Brother Jason Blakey is his name, he had tried to start a band there in 2002 or 2001, I can't remember which now. And so I was teaching that band, and Helen had started coming and teaching as well at that band. But we were teaching the other bands, and one day the 3 of us were having a beer, and we were discussing what can we do with these bands. They've got nothing to do unless they're boys brigade. There's nothing for them because the boys brigade didn't allow outsider into their little competition. So we decided we'd run a competition for just those half a dozen bands that I was teaching. And we then thought, well, how are we going to do that but make it legitimate? So the next thing is we thought, well, why don't we start a pipe band association? And that pipe band association was registered the following year after that first competition. So that first competition we had in 2008, we brought Nat Russell and Bill Russell up to judge that. And Nat's now a life membership of our pipe band association here. He's been here every year to judge. He only missed 1 year when there was tragedy in his family, and that was in 2019. Every other year he's been here, and on 2 or 3 occasions when he couldn't really afford to bring him, he just brought himself. Remember in 2018, I think. Going back to where we were, we had 5 bands at that competition. It was a reasonable standard for a middle-of-the-road 4B. It wasn't too bad. But we had one band in particular, and I'm still actually teaching that band, but they've fallen on tragedy as well. But they just clicked, not with anything else but themselves. And they just wanted to progress. And they had a very good school teacher in charge at that particular school who was very helpful. And they just went from bound to bound to bound to bound. In the first competition after 2008, they won every single solo trophy. So we went up to around about, I think it was B grade in drumming and C grade in piping, and they won every single solo, and they won the band. They won the bands every year after that through to 2016. and they by then in grade 3, and they were a very, very good grade 3 level. They would have done reasonably well, probably better than reasonably well in any decent competition around the world. Then they fell on hard times because school matters changed, and they were basically locked out of their practice rooms and unable to get their instruments for many weeks. At the end of many weeks, a lot of them have departed for various reasons. We also have an issue here, which is a very good issue, generally speaking, but we have national service.
Mm-hmm.
And so our schools here go from grade 7 to grade 10, and then they leave that school and they go to junior college, the same as in the US, and they do years 11 and 12. And then the year after that, the boys go into the army for 2 years. And it's a little bit more user-friendly now, but 10 years ago, it was pretty tough going. They weren't allowed out, basically, for anything other than family matters. And then after that, they go to university. So we basically lose 90% of our players at year 10.
Yeah. And what age would that
just
be?
Lucky with the band. Yeah, the band I was talking about, we were just lucky with them. They held out for another 5 or 6 years before that happened to them. So we're still doing okay. We had another band that we allowed to play in grade 3, but they weren't grade 3. They were probably a reasonable grade 4A. And we had a couple of bands coming down from Malaysia and Hong Kong, and 2 of them were the same thing, bordering on grade 3, but probably not, so we let them in. And staggered through until, of course, 2020. And that's totally decimated us here in Singapore.
Yeah.
Our biggest problem, of course, is we can't blow our pipes at home because it's all in a city and we all live in apartments. Yeah, well, even the sound will come out through the windows and there'll straight away be a report made and the police turn up and you're actually in big trouble. So the only place you can blow your pipes is in a designated practice place and only at certain times. So most of us practice in a school, except on Sundays and Saturday evenings, for instance. So that causes us a lot of problems, and the same thing occurs in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong and Singapore are absolutely decimated by this lockdown that we've had. This little band out at Northland now that we have only one boy leaving this month at the end of his 4 years. The first year he had lessons. The second year he had no lessons. So he'd just been given his pipes and then there was no more lessons for him. The third year, he had no lessons for the first half of the year and then Zoom lessons and no bagpipes for the second semester. So this year he's had his pipes back, but they've had other problems out there that's caused him to miss about 20 weeks of blowing his bagpipes. So he's finishing his career after 4 years with probably around about 30 weeks of blowing his bagpipes once a week for half an hour. The lockdown, they lifted it in parts, and they allowed the kids to have online lessons for the second half of last year. But the onlines were on Zoom, so they were totally useless. I mean, on Zoom, you can't play together because there's a lag and it just doesn't work. This year, it was nearly totally lifted at the start of the year, but the kids couldn't practice as a band. They had to be in groups of years. So with a small band like this one, we have about 8 or 10 pipers. 2 or 3 are in Sec 4, 2 or 3 are in Sec 3. So the ones in Sec 3 need the Sec 4s to. So we went for the first term like that. Second term, all was lifted. Everything was fine. And then the school had problems because they hosted mother tongue exams for that term for the whole of Singapore. So we couldn't make any noise in that school for 11 weeks. So, but this is the same thing has happened in Hong Kong. So we're not unique down here, and it happened in Malaysia as well. But Malaysia have a bit more space and less threat of being raided by the police for making noise. So they have started a little bit better than we have, but not much better. They were banned for longer than we were, but freed up better than we were. So yeah, so the whole of Asia has really suffered, I think, worse than anyone. And I'm still on the judging panel in Australia, so I get all the correspondence and everything there. They're pretty well back to normal, although the standard is much lower than it was 3 years ago, but they're back to normal. We're not.
My understanding is that Asia, generally speaking, took a much more stringent view of trying to control the spread of COVID. And that started much earlier than what we did, and it existed much more longer after we had stopped.
Yes, that's right.
The restrictions. And I know that it affected pipe bans generally in this country to a great extent. And there was an extreme worry about where drummers were going to come from after 2 years of lockdown, because everybody imagined that the drummers would just walk off. Unlike pipers who can practice in a solo fashion in the house, drummers have got no incentive to practice alone in the house, if you like. Plus, you've got the noise factor as well over and above that. So this year, a full calendar of pipe band competitions, and lo and behold, a pretty decent turnout. I think, as off the top of my head, maybe 70–80% of the bands are back up and running. And I don't know about the lower grades, but I didn't hear a great deal of comment about adverse playing and this, that, next thing. But I can tell you the grade 1 competition was as good as ever. World's another competition. And it's truly amazing. And it's to the credit of all concerned that they managed to pull themselves up the bootstraps so quickly this year, because I thought it'd take a good couple of seasons before the standard come up. But you've got a much greater problem. You've got the noise factor when they're practicing alone. You've also got where they can practice, but over and above that is when they can practice and how much tuition they get and when they get the tuition. So you've got a lot of adverse conditions going against your piping and drumming and your pipe bands in Singapore and elsewhere. And I just wonder, you've summarised it very well there, but I wonder how you see the future in Singapore as far as piping is concerned. And moving on from that, piping and drumming and pipe bands are concerned. We'll stick to that question first. How do you see a future?
Well, the one thing about Singaporeans is they are, when they make up their minds to do something, they do it 100%. There's no mucking around. They either do it or they don't do it. And I was talking to one of my friends from Victoria, or he's actually in New South Wales, but right on the border. Scotty Nicholson. I was talking to him a month ago. I'm going to be seeing him again in a week's time. And I said to him, you know, this pandemic has taken us back 20 years in Singapore. We're back to where we were 20 years ago when I first came here, when people didn't even know that there was anything except a G grace note. They didn't know there was a D grace note. The drummers didn't know there was syncopation or anything like that. And I was a bit down in the mouth about it. But since then, I thought to myself, we're worse then than we were 20 years ago. And the reason for that is because the MOE, the Education Department, fully backed pipes and drums 20 years ago and gave us all that we needed in all of the schools to accomplish something. Now the present leadership isn't so keen on what they call CCAs. And so we haven't got that powerful backing that we can say to the kids, you must turn up for your lesson. Now they don't have to if they don't want to. So it's going to be a struggle. But we just had an association meeting last Saturday, and what we're planning is to change our perspective on our competition for a couple of years. And we're going to reduce the requirements, numerical requirements for the band, not the standard. We'll maintain the normal requirements for the standard of playing and what has to be played. But we're thinking that we'll bring it down to mini band status, but we're thinking, and I'm pretty sure we will call it super mini bands. Can be 4 pipers minimum, but it can also be 6 maximum. And instead of 2 snare drummers, it can be 3 snare drummers. And instead of 1 tenor drummer, it can be 2, or it can be 2 and it can be 1. And that'll allow some of these bands that are really struggling to at least put a mini band in to a competition. And a band that's going a bit better, it's basically a minimum requirement for a grade 4 band, 6'3", and a bass drummer, basically. And we're hoping that'll just give us a bit of lift. It'll probably also allow us to entice some of the Australian bands. We've had really good support from the Australian bands leading up to the pandemic. We had quite a lot of them coming up here. But that might entice more of them to come up because they can bring in a smaller unit at less cost. Because we need them. We need them to validate our grading system. Because we suffered from what I suffered from when I was a teenager. Bands in Perth were saying, well, we're grade 1 bands. But when they went to Sydney or Melbourne, they weren't grade 1 bands at all. They were probably grade 3 or grade 2 bands. And we suffer from that here. The bands think, oh, we won the competition, so we should be elevated up to the next level. So that's our approach to it for the future. We will get it back. We will get it back, but I think it's going to take a bit longer than Scotland, Australia, New Zealand, places like that. I think this is probably a 5-year plan. Also have the benefit of the Malaysian bands. Yeah. That they need something too. They've got nothing up there. So the only place for them to come is down to us. And also if we reduce the numerical numbers a little bit, that might entice more of them to come down. And so we can get it happening again. But the other thing is we've lost all our parades. We had a St. Patrick's Day parade that basically gave us a donation, which was enough to bring our judges up every year. Now that's gone because they weren't allowed to parade, and I don't think that's ever going to restart.
Going out and practicing for a gig or a parade or a competition, and if there's nothing to practice for, the incentive's not there to get better, so to speak. And even although you're only doing a small parade, the fact you've got to do that makes you get the instrument out the box and practice it beforehand. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you really need to play for.
The St. Patrick's Day was wonderful for us because they weren't too concerned about how good we sounded. We didn't sound bad, mind you, for a mass band. We had about 100 every year. But what it did for us was it allowed us to give first-time pipers and drummers, but more importantly pipers, a chance to get out, put their pipes up on their shoulder, and it didn't matter if they didn't blow. All we asked them to do is blow your drones if you can't play. And all of a sudden, these little kids are playing in a band 100 strong. And I could see it every year, a month after that competition, the difference in the attitude of the kids. They were all excited about it. Now at Pipers. But it also, the teachers, unfortunately, the teachers of bands, the tutors, they forget this too, that if they don't have something that they're asking the kids, particularly the kids, to practice for, the kids won't practice.
What do you know about solo piping in Singapore?
Well, it's been pretty good. We've had a pretty good 12 years, pretty good 12 years up until the pandemic. And we had one particular guy, his name's Julius Lee. He came over to Scotland and he spent 6 months at the college. And he came back and he was playing at a wonderful standard. And we had him in A grade. And he certainly, there was only 3 in it the year he won it, but he certainly won it against 2 Hong Kong fellas who now one's in Scotland. I think he's for shots, I'm not sure. So we got up to a pretty good standard. We had Julius and maybe one other in A grade. These are genuine grades, not fictitious local grades. We had 2 or 3 in B grade. We had about 4 or 5 in C grade, and then we had about maybe 12 in D grade, and about 30 in novice every year. Now that has changed because I know for a fact that two of the B graders that I've talked about, they've basically given it up because of this pandemic. So that's 2 gone. But can I just say that I'm talking specifically about Singapore, but every year the piping solo generally includes the Hong Kong fellas. And some of them are at a pretty high standard. Tony Ma, he's definitely a decent A grade standard. Chris Lee is the one I'm talking about. I think he's with shots. We have another one from up there. We're now just in that situation where we just have to wait and see. And we are definitely going to be able to run a competition next year, which will be in June. It always has been in June, so I'm hoping it will be again. I think we have to wait to then. We did just run a little, not a competition, but an online submission thing. And that was for me to get a feeling of actually where we were. And that's what prompted us to go with this lesser numbers situation, because all except one of the submissions was a very low numbers playing, and the standard was very, very low. But I expected it. Well, actually, it wasn't as low as I expected, but it was still very, very low. So I think it's really, we just got to.
Or it's just about 80 miles north of the equator. And I wondered how the weather affected the instruments and that sort of thing. How you got on with the weather in Singapore and instruments, bagpipes, drums, that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's hard to hold tuning for very long because they do run very dry, but not probably as bad as in the really cold weather, so there's 2 sides to the equation, isn't there? There's one thing is we don't need all the paraphernalia because we don't have a problem with wetness of pipes.
So it's a dry climate then?
Yeah, it's very dry. Well, it's humid, but it's dry. I suppose the biggest problem we have here is fatigue, because generally speaking, by the time you've tuned up, gone through the set a couple of times, tuned up again, and gone on to play, you're pretty well buggered. I think
is that because of the heat?
Yeah, the heat and humidity. Yeah. Yeah. Some of them are really struggling by the time they actually hit the line.
And do your tropical insects come in and eat the instruments or anything like that? No? No,
not too bad, no. Actually, this is a funny thing that I discovered when I first came here. There's not many insects here. It's not like what you would think. It's we don't have flies, for instance. We don't. We have mosquitoes. We have cockroaches.
But I understand that Singapore has a problem with lack of water.
Yeah, the water comes in from Malaysia. It's piped down from Malaysia.
Yeah.
There's plenty of rain, but it goes straight out to sea again. Because when it comes down, it's torrential, and they've got canals, and it just goes straight out to sea.
No.
They've got reservoirs, but that only holds the water that's piped in. It's so dense here, with the population is so dense that yeah, it's no real catchment at all.
It's really
It would seem
desalination.
strange.
You really need to get into desalination plants and that sort of thing.
Yeah, they've got that. They've got one of those, and that's doing about 20% of the water they need, I think.
Yeah.
A lot of bottled water. They've done that. They've got all those things here. They're a wonderful government here. Wonderful. Even though you might say it's a gerrymander or whatever, the one thing that I've noticed about the government is they don't have to worry about being re-elected. So they get on and do the job of governing, and they do everything so properly when they do it. So they've got desalination plants. They've got quite a big solar power generation plant. All those sort of things they've got, and everything's very correct.
Well, that's excellent talking to you this morning, Alan, and thanks very much for your time to Pipers'Persuasion.
Okay. Can I tell you a little story that you probably want to edit out afterwards? But this is about a drummer. And this particular drummer in 1980-90, I did a tour of Scotland, primarily to visit Craigellachie Bridge, where my father's ashes had been put 2 years earlier. But I made it a business trip, and I went to many bands, particularly Shots, particularly Bogle, and particularly Torfican, the three of them. But I was in Glasgow for a couple of days, and I'd made an appointment quite a number of months earlier to go up and see Strathclyde Police practice.
Okay.
So I turned up on this particular day, and Nickel was there, and he showed me all around downstairs, and we were down there for an hour or more, and he showed me all the things, which was very, very nice to see. And he said, I'll take you upstairs to see Ian. So I went up, and they were just playing something. I forgot what it was. And they stopped playing, and Ian said, well, lads, we got the job on Tuesday, and want you here, you know how Ian talks. And he said, so we'll see you then. And they all packed up. And Ian came over to Nickel and said, is this the gentleman that was coming to see me? And he introduced me, and Ian said, well, I'm sorry, lad, I'm sorry. He said, we're finished. And I said, oh, that's a pity. And he said, yeah, when I have a practice, if I have a good practice, I don't carry on. If it's a bad practice, I'll go till midnight, but if it's a good one, I won't carry on. So they're all going home. And I said, oh, well, never mind. Would have been nice to have heard you play a bit, but never mind. He said, well, oh, well. He said, well, do you have a drink? And I said, oh, yeah, I have a drink. And he said, what do you like? And I said, kind of beer, Guinness or whatever. And he said, well, give me 2 minutes. He went away, put his gear away, and he said, come with me. He said, are you driving? And I said, yeah. Car's parked in the car park around the back there. And he said, well, follow me. He showed me his car, and he said, follow me. We're going down to the river. So he took me to a pub down on the river there. I don't know its name. And then we went, and he said, what'll you have? And I said, oh, I'll have a Guinness. They've got it on tap. And he said, yeah, so will I. So he said, 2 pints. And I took out some money. He said, no, son, I'll buy this one. He bought me a Guinness. We knocked that one down. We're having a good old chat about nothing in particular, not too much about pipe bands, in fact. And I said, well, better have another one, huh? So he said, yeah, I'll have another one. So another 2 came. I took my money out. He said, put your money away, son. You're in Glasgow. This is my town, not yours. So we had 4 pints.
Good.
And I started to drive back. I had to drive back to Edinburgh. But anyway, we had a long talk about things and parted. That was in 89. And then in 94, Ian came out to judge the Australian Championships in Victoria.
Okay.
And on the Friday night beforehand, they have a briefing for all the bands and they introduce the judges and then they have a few beers afterwards. And he was surrounded by people from start to finish. But there was a short gap when he was not by himself, but there was only a couple of people who were my friends anyway. So I wandered over and I said, "Hi, Ian, would you remember me?" He said, "I do, son." And then he started talking about all the things we'd been talking about 5 years earlier.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean by, this is from a drummer. I'm thinking, here's the world's greatest pipe major at the time. And he remembers talking to a drummer from Western Australia, which is as far away from piping as you can get. And he remembered our conversation.